Hi there, Bruce here, and today we're going to cover the book of Numbers. And in Numbers, again, these books all came together about the same time, written by Moses, and around 1450 BC, the same as Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. And the purpose of this book was to tell the story of how Israel prepared to enter the Promised Land. The contents include how they prepared for the journey, the first approach to the Promised Land, subsequent wandering in the wilderness, and then a second approach to the Promised Land. So to set the stage, the first census of Hebrew men over 20 was taken. And at the time, there were about 600,000, a little bit more than 600,000, with an additional 20,000 Levites charged with taking care of the tabernacle. And only Aaron and his sons, as previously mentioned in Leviticus, were designated for the priesthood. And in chapter 6, a blessing from Aaron was given, and it included the contents, "May the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace." Now, the people didn't like their experience in the desert, and they complained quite a bit about it. Moses decided to send 12 spies, and he picked one from each tribe, into the land of Canaan, where they stayed for 40 days. And they reported back to Moses that it was a magnificent land, but it had giants in it. And two of the spies out of the 12 that went, including Joshua and Caleb, said the land could be taken by the Hebrews, or the Israelites, because God was with them. But the others disagreed and didn't believe that they could take it. God speaks in Numbers 14 and says, in chapter 29, he wasn't pleased and said that no one over the age of 20 at the time of the census would enter the Promised Land. And then later in chapter 34 goes on to say that the Hebrews must wander the desert for 40 years because of their rejection of him. So later on in chapter 20 of Numbers, God tells Moses in verse 8 to use Aaron's staff to talk to a rock and tell it to pour out water. Now, this had happened several times before, and it was in response to the people complaining that they didn't have any water. In verse 11, Moses doesn't quite follow those directions, and he strikes the rock twice. Water gushes out of the rock, and because he disobeyed God, God told Moses that he would not be the person to bring people into the Promised Land. So later, a new census was taken, and it still showed, like the first census, that there were about 600 people now, with 23,000 Levites, a little bit more than before. But the only ones that were in the original 600,000 person census were Caleb and Joshua. And God told Moses in Numbers 27, verse 12 through 14, that he could look from the Abraham Mountains and see the Promised Land, but he couldn't go there because he had to die in those mountains. And Joshua would be his replacement leader. So in summary, there's kind of three core pieces of Numbers, and they include the census, the rebellion, and the wandering. So regarding the census, Moses counted the Israelites twice. The first census organized the people into marching units so they could defend themselves. The second prepared them to conquer the country east of the Jordan River. The importance of that is that people have to be organized, trained, and led to be effective in great movements. It's always wise to count the cost before setting out on any great undertaking. When we're aware of the obstacles before us, we can more easily avoid them. So in God's work, we must remove barriers in our relationships with others so that our effectiveness is not diminished. When we look at rebellion, 12 scouts were sent out to the land of Canaan to report what was going on with the enemies. Now, when those scouts returned, 10 said that they should give up and go back to Egypt. As a result, the people refused to enter the land. So faced with a choice, Israel rebelled against God. Now, rebellion didn't start with an uprising, but with complaining, griping, murmuring against Moses and God. So the importance of that, though, is that rebellion against God is always a serious matter. It's not something to be taken lightly. For God's punishment for sin is often very severe. Our rebellion doesn't usually begin with all-out warfare, but in more subtle ways. Usually begins with complaining or criticizing. So as we think about this situation, think about your negative comments and to make sure that they're not the product of a rebellious spirit. And finally, as we look at the wandering, because the people rebelled, the Israelites wandered 40 years in the wilderness. This shows how severely God can punish sin. 40 years was enough time for all of those who held on to the original customs and values to die off. It gave time for a new generation to come in with a different perspective. God judges sin because he's holy. The wanderings in the wilderness demonstrate how serious God considers that flagrant disobedience of his commands. So purging our lives of sin is vital for God's purpose. And that's the book of Numbers in 10 minutes or less.